The wailing of a newborn suddenly fell silent as the midwife's face crumpled in despair. Theodora Turner clutched the bedsheets, her sweat-soaked body trembling as she searched the older woman's eyes for a glimmer of hope that wouldn't come. It was 1876 in Val Verde, Texas, and Theodora had just lost her third baby in as many years. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Turner," the midwife whispered, wrapping the tiny, still body in a clean cloth. "The Lord has called another angel home." Theodora turned her face to the wall, tears streaming silently down her hollow cheeks. Her husband, Edwin, would be waiting outside, pacing the porch of their modest home at the edge of town. He would know from the midwife's face what had happened, just as he had twice before. The sound of the door opening and closing, muffled voices exchanging words she couldn't bear to hear, then heavy footsteps approaching the bedroom. Edwin stood in the doorway, his face a mask of grief and something else resignation. "Theodora," he said, his voice flat, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed was brief, but it shattered what remained of Theodora's world. Edwin couldn't bear another loss. The whispers in town were getting louder that Theodora was cursed, that no child of hers would ever draw breath for long. He was leaving for California, where his brother had found gold prospects. He would send money when he could. By morning he was gone, and Theodora was alone with her grief. 2 years passed. Theodora Turner, now 26, lived in a small house on the outskirts of Val Verde. The townsfolk called her Widow Turner. Though Edwin had never actually died, he had simply vanished into the West, letters and money dwindling to nothing after 6 months. She worked as a seamstress, mending clothes and creating dresses for the women of Val Verde, her nimble fingers keeping her fed while her heart remained frozen in grief. The whispers followed her whenever she ventured into town. "Cursed," they said, when they thought she couldn't hear. 3 babies, all dead before they drew proper breath. The Lord doesn't want her to be a mother. Some of the more superstitious residents crossed themselves when she passed. Others simply avoided her gaze as if her misfortune might be catching. Only Mrs. Abernathy, the general store owner's wife, treated her with any real kindness, often slipping extra supplies into her packages, or saving the choicest fabrics for Theodora's sewing work. It was a Tuesday in late spring when Xavier Caldwell rode into Val Verde. The town had seen its share of newcomers since the railroad had come through 2 years prior, but Xavier stood out. Tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin and keen hazel eyes, he sat his dun-colored stallion with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. The townsfolk watched with interest as he dismounted outside the general store, dust from the trail coating his clothes. His black Stetson was pulled low over his brow, and a well-worn leather vest covered his cotton shirt. The spurs on his boots jingled lightly as he tied his horse to the hitching post and stretched his back after the long ride. Inside the store, Theodora was selecting thread and buttons for her latest commission, a wedding dress for the banker's daughter. She kept her eyes on her task, avoiding the curious glances of other customers. The bell above the door jingled, and she sensed rather than saw the newcomer enter, bringing with him the scent of leather, horse, and the open prairie. "Afternoon," came a deep voice with a slight Tennessee drawl. "I'm looking for Mr. Abernathy. I've got a letter of introduction from Jim Carson over in El Paso." Mrs. Abernathy, a plump woman with kind eyes, smiled warmly. "My husband's in the back. I'll fetch him for you. Who shall I say is calling?" "Xavier Caldwell, madam." Theodora kept her head down, selecting a pearl button from a tray and examining it closely. She had learned to make herself invisible in public spaces, a ghost moving through the world of the living. "Miss, you think these would match?" The deep voice was suddenly addressing her, and Theodora looked up startled to find Xavier Caldwell standing beside her, holding up a spool of cream-colored ribbon. "For what purpose, sir?" Her voice came out hoarse from disuse. "My sister's getting married back in Tennessee. Thought I might send her something pretty." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and Theodora noticed a small scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "For a wedding, you might prefer this." She reached for a spool of satin ribbon, the color of fresh cream with a slight shimmer. "It would complement a bride's gown nicely." He took the ribbon from her, his fingers briefly brushing against hers. Theodora pulled her hand back as if burned, unused to casual contact. "Much obliged, miss." "Mrs. Turner," she corrected quietly. Before Xavier could respond, Mr. Abernathy emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mr. Caldwell, Jim's letter arrived last week. We've been expecting you." Xavier tipped his hat to Theodora before turning to the storekeeper. "Good to meet you, sir. I hope the position is still available." "Indeed it is. Not many men want to take on managing a ranch these days, what with the railroad bringing other opportunities. But if Jim vouches for you, that's good enough for me. We can discuss details over dinner tonight." Theodora gathered her purchases and approached Mrs. Abernathy to pay, keeping her eyes averted from the two men. "That'll be 75 cents, Theodora," Mrs. Abernathy said gently. As Theodora counted out her coins, she felt eyes on her. Looking up, she caught Xavier Caldwell studying her with interest before he quickly looked away. The following Sunday found Theodora sitting alone in the back pew of the small white church. She came to services regularly, though she often wondered why. The comfort of faith had abandoned her after her third loss, but the routine of church attendance gave structure to her empty weeks. Pastor Williams delivered his sermon on the book of Job, speaking of suffering and divine purpose. Theodora stared at her hands, folded in her lap atop her worn Bible. How many times had well-meaning townspeople told her that God had a plan, that her suffering served some greater purpose? The words had long since lost all meaning. After the service, she slipped out quickly, avoiding the social hour that followed. She was halfway down the church steps when a voice called out to her, "Mrs. Turner." She turned to see Xavier Caldwell approaching, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, a dark suit that seemed a size too small across his broad shoulders. "Mr. Caldwell," she acknowledged with a small nod. "I was hoping to catch you. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you're a seamstress." Theodora nodded again. "I am. Well, as you can see," he gestured to his ill-fitting jacket, "I'm in dire need of proper clothes. The Abernathys have been kind enough to take me in while I get settled as their ranch manager, but I can't keep attending church looking like I borrowed clothes from a smaller man." A ghost of a smile touched Theodora's lips before she could stop it. "I could help with that. I'd be much obliged." "When would be a good time to call on you for measurements?" Theodora hesitated. She rarely received visitors at her home and never men. It wasn't proper for a woman living alone. "Perhaps tomorrow afternoon at 3. I'll be finished with my current commission by then." "Tomorrow at 3 it is." "Where might I find your home?" "The white house with blue shutters, just past the creek on the east road." Xavier nodded. "Until tomorrow, then, Mrs. Turner." As he walked away, Theodora became aware of whispers and stares from a group of women gathered near the church doors. Mrs. Pratt, the blacksmith's wife, was watching with narrowed eyes, leaning close to whisper something to Mrs. Wellington. Theodora lifted her chin and walked quickly away, her heart beating faster than it had in years. True to his word, Xavier arrived at precisely 3 o'clock the following day. Theodora had spent the morning cleaning her small home, then chided herself for the effort. This was business, nothing more. Afternoon, Mrs. Turner, Xavier said as she opened the door. He'd removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Please come in, Mr. Caldwell." She stepped aside to let him enter the neat front room that served as her workshop. A dress form stood in one corner, draped with the nearly completed wedding gown. Swatches of fabric were organized in labeled boxes on shelves along one wall, and her sewing machine, a recent investment that had cost nearly all her savings, sat on a sturdy table by the window. "You have a lovely home," Xavier said, glancing around. His eyes lingered on a small framed daguerreotype on the mantel. Theodora on her wedding day, standing beside Edwin, both looking solemn. "Thank you." She gestured to a space near the window. "If you'll stand here, I'll take your measurements." Xavier complied, standing still as she retrieved her measuring tape and small notebook. She worked efficiently, noting his broad shoulders, the length of his arms, his chest measurement. He remained quiet as she worked, but she could feel his eyes on her. "You're new to Val Verde," she said finally, breaking the silence as she measured the length from his shoulder to his wrist. "Yes, madam. Spent the last 5 years working cattle in West Texas and New Mexico. Before that, I fought in the war." "Which side?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. "Union," he answered without hesitation. "My family never owned slaves, didn't believe in it." Theodora nodded, continuing her work. "And now you're to manage the Abernathy Ranch." "Yes, madam." "Mr. Abernathy isn't getting any younger, and his sons have both moved east for schooling. He needs someone to oversee the cattle operation." "It's good land," Theodora commented. "My husband and I used to ride out that way on Sundays before." She trailed off, realizing she'd said more than intended. Xavier didn't press, simply nodding. "I've heard some talk in town," he said carefully as she measured his inseam, maintaining a professional distance. "About your husband heading west." Theodora's hands stilled for a moment before she continued her work. "Yes, California. Gold fever took him 2 years ago." "I'm sorry." She straightened, recording the final measurements in her notebook. "No need, it was his choice." "Still," Xavier said, his voice gentle, "it couldn't have been easy being left alone." Something in his tone made Theodora look up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. There was no pity there, just a quiet understanding that caught her off guard. "No," she admitted. "It wasn't easy." She cleared her throat, stepping back. "I should have these ready in about 2 weeks. 1 suit for Sundays and 2 work shirts as you requested. Half payment in advance, if you please." Xavier reached into his pocket and counted out the coins. "Take your time, Mrs. Turner. I'm not going anywhere." After he left, Theodora sat at her sewing machine for a long while, not working, just staring out the window at the road that led back to town. The weeks passed, and Theodora found herself with regular visits from Xavier Caldwell. First for fittings, then for additional commissioned shirts, a new vest, even a winter coat, though summer was approaching. Each visit lasted a little longer than strictly necessary for business, with Xavier finding reasons to linger, asking about her garden or commenting on books he spotted on her small shelf. In town, the whispers changed. No longer was she just the cursed woman or poor widow Turner. Now she was the subject of speculation and gossip of a different kind. The nerve of that man, calling on her so often, Theodora overheard Mrs. Wellington say one afternoon at the general store. "Doesn't he know what happened to her babies? God's judgment is clear." "Perhaps he doesn't care for children," Mrs. Pratt replied with a sniff. "Or perhaps he just wants what men want, without the blessing of marriage." Theodora's cheeks burned as she pretended to examine a bolt of calico fabric, but Mrs. Abernathy came to her rescue. "Ladies," she said sharply, "I won't have such talk in my store. Mr. Caldwell is a good Christian man and a hard worker. My husband thinks the world of him." The women fell silent, but their disapproving looks spoke volumes. Later that day, as Theodora walked home with her purchases, she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. Turning, she saw Xavier approaching on his horse. "Mrs. Turner," he called, slowing his mount to a walk beside her. "Allow me to escort you home." "That's not necessary, Mr. Caldwell." "Perhaps not necessary, but I'd consider it a privilege." His smile was warm, but Theodora could only think of the whispers in town. "People will talk," she said quietly. Xavier's expression sobered. "They already do, from what I gather." Theodora looked away. "Then you've heard." "About your losses?" "Yes, Mrs. Abernathy mentioned it, though she spoke with kindness." "And the curse?" Theodora's voice was barely audible. Xavier dismounted, leading his horse as he fell into step beside her. "Mrs. Turner, Theodora, if I may, I've lived long enough to know that tragedy isn't a curse. It's part of life's burden, heavier for some than others." She looked up at him, searching his face for insincerity but finding none. "3 babies," she said, the words like stones in her mouth. "All boys. None lived more than a few hours." Xavier was quiet for a moment before responding. "I'm truly sorry for your suffering." They walked in silence until they reached her gate. Theodora hesitated, then made a decision. "Would you like to come in for coffee, Mr. Caldwell?" His smile returned. "I'd like that very much. And please call me Xavier." Inside, as Theodora prepared the coffee, Xavier settled into a chair at her small kitchen table. There was a comfortable ease to his presence that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. "Tell me about Tennessee," she said as she set a steaming cup before him. Xavier's face lit up as he spoke of rolling hills and deciduous forests, so different from the scrubby plains of Texas. He told her about his parents' small farm, his 4 sisters, and the youngest Emily, who was soon to be married. "And what brought you west?" Theodora asked, sipping her coffee. A shadow crossed Xavier's face. "The war changed things, changed me. Couldn't settle back into farm life afterward." "Needed open spaces, I suppose." Theodora nodded. Many men had drifted west after the war, seeking something they couldn't name. "And your husband?" Xavier asked cautiously. "Have you had word from California?" Theodora set down her cup. "No, not for over a year now." She hesitated, then added, "I don't expect to." Xavier studied her face. "He was a fool to leave." The blunt statement startled her. "He couldn't bear another loss," she said defensively, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to explain Edwin's abandonment. "All the more reason he should have stayed by your side," Xavier replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You suffered the same losses, and you had the physical toll as well." Theodora stared at him, unexpected tears welling in her eyes. No one had ever acknowledged her pain so directly, so matter-of-factly. The town had whispered about curses and divine punishment, while Edwin had simply fled. "I should go," Xavier said, rising as he noticed her distress. "I've upset you." "No," Theodora said quickly. "It's just—" "No one has ever put it quite that way before." Xavier hesitated, then reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "Thank you for the coffee, Theodora. May I call again?" She nodded, unable to find words. At the door, he turned. "Would you consider joining me for a picnic this Sunday after church? The weather promises to be fine." Theodora thought of the whispers, the stares, the judgment. Then she thought of the quiet understanding in Xavier's eyes. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." Summer bloomed across Val Verde, bringing scorching days and warm nights filled with the chirping of cicadas. Theodora's life, once a monotonous routine of work and solitude, now included regular visits from Xavier, Sunday picnics along the creek, and even occasional rides on the Abernathy ranch, where Xavier taught her to handle a gentle mare. The gossip in town intensified. Some neighbors stopped bringing their mending to Theodora, though Mrs. Abernathy made sure to send extra work her way to compensate. Pastor Williams paid her a visit one afternoon, ostensibly to check on her well-being but clearly to assess the propriety of her friendship with Xavier. "People are concerned, Mrs. Turner," he said, perched uncomfortably on her sofa. "A woman alone receiving regular visits from a bachelor, it raises eyebrows." "We've done nothing improper, Pastor," Theodora replied, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Mr. Caldwell has been a perfect gentleman." "I'm sure he has," the pastor said, not unkindly. "But appearances matter in a small town like ours, and there's the matter of your situation." Theodora stiffened. "My situation?" "Your unfortunate history with childbearing," he clarified, looking uncomfortable. "Some feel it would be unfair for Mr. Caldwell to enter into a relationship without fully understanding the limitations." Anger flared in Theodora's chest, hot and unfamiliar after years of numbness. "I assure you, Pastor, Mr. Caldwell is fully aware of my history. And I wasn't aware that my personal tragedy was a subject for town discussion." Pastor Williams had the grace to look abashed. "I apologize if I've overstepped. I'm merely concerned for both your reputations." After he left, Theodora sat alone, trembling with indignation. She had expected Xavier to drift away once he learned of her past. Yet he had done the opposite, drawing closer, seeking her company with a persistence that both frightened and exhilarated her. When Xavier arrived the following evening, Theodora told him of the pastor's visit. "They think I'm taking advantage of you," he said, a muscle twitching in his jaw, "or that you're somehow deceiving me." "Perhaps we should be more circumspect," Theodora suggested reluctantly. "Meet less often or only in public places." Xavier's expression hardened. "I won't let small-minded gossip dictate my actions, Theodora, unless you wish me to stay away." The question hung between them, heavy with implication. "No," she admitted quietly. "I don't want that." His face softened. "Good, because I've grown rather fond of our time together." That night, after Xavier left, Theodora stood before her small mirror, really looking at herself for the first time in years. Her chestnut hair, once dull with grief, now had a healthy shine. The hollows beneath her cheekbones had filled out slightly, and there was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. She was changing, coming back to life, and it terrified her. August brought a terrible drought to Val Verde. The creek shrank to a trickle, crops withered in the fields, and tempers grew short in the relentless heat. Xavier worked from dawn to dusk at the Abernathy ranch, struggling to keep the cattle watered and fed on increasingly parched rangeland. Theodora saw less of him during this period, understanding the demands of his work. When they did meet, often for brief suppers at her home, he arrived exhausted, dust coating his clothes, his face lined with worry. "We've lost 6 head already," he told her one evening over a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "If rain doesn't come soon, it could be much worse." "The whole town is praying for rain," Theodora said, refilling his coffee cup. "Pastor Williams has called for a special service tomorrow evening." Xavier nodded tiredly, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I'll be there if I can, though I'll be poor company for the Lord, as tired as I am." Theodora studied him across the table, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the new lines at their corners. In just a few months, he had become essential to her world, a fixture she couldn't imagine being without. "Xavier," she said hesitantly, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He looked up, eyebrows raised in question. "Why me? Of all the women in Val Verde, young women without my history, why do you spend your time with me?" Xavier set down his cup, considering her question with the same thoughtful attention he gave to everything. "When I first came to town," he began slowly. "I noticed you right away. Not just because you're beautiful, though you are." He held up a hand as Theodora began to protest. "You are, whether you believe it or not, but it was more than that. You carried yourself with such quiet dignity despite the whispers that followed you." He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "I've known plenty of people marked by tragedy, Theodora. Some let it embitter them, others let it defeat them. But you kept going. You built a life for yourself. You continued to create beautiful things with your hands even when your heart was broken." Theodora sat very still, afraid to break the spell of his words. "As for your past losses," Xavier continued, "they're part of you, part of your story. They shaped you, but they don't define you, and they certainly don't make you worth less in my eyes." A tear slipped down Theodora's cheek, and she brushed it away quickly. "I don't know if I can ever have children, Xavier," she whispered. "The doctor in Austin said there might be something wrong with me, something that prevents, that causes the babies to come too early." Xavier reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Theodora, I'm not courting you for the children you might bear. I'm courting you because of who you are now, sitting across from me." The word courting hung in the air between them, the first time either had put a name to what was happening. "Is that what you're doing?" Theodora asked, her voice barely audible. "Courting me?" "Yes," Xavier answered simply, "if you'll have me." The prayer service for rain was held the following evening, with nearly the entire town crowded into the small church. Theodora arrived early, securing a seat near the back as was her custom. To her surprise, Xavier slipped into the pew beside her just as the service was beginning, his hair still damp from a hasty washing. "Made it," he whispered with a tired smile. Throughout the service, Theodora was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers, of the deep rumble of his voice joining in the hymns. She was also aware of the glances from other congregants, some curious, some disapproving. After the final prayer, as people began to file out, Mrs. Wellington approached, her thin face set in disapproval. "Mrs. Turner," she said coldly, before turning to Xavier. "Mr. Caldwell, I wonder if you might call on my niece while she's visiting from San Antonio. She's a lovely girl of 20, from a good family." Xavier's expression didn't change, but Theodora felt him tense beside her. "Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Wellington, but my attentions are already engaged elsewhere." He placed a hand lightly at the small of Theodora's back, a clear statement of his intentions. Mrs. Wellington's lips thinned to a bloodless line. "I see. Well, should you reconsider, my niece will be here for another month. She's young and healthy with excellent prospects for a family." The implication was unmistakable. Theodora felt the familiar shame rising, but before she could respond, Xavier spoke again. "Mrs. Wellington," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of steel, "I'm not in the market for a broodmare. I'm fortunate enough to have found a woman of intelligence, grace, and character. Good evening to you." He guided Theodora past the gaping woman and out into the hot night air. Once outside, Theodora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, though her heart was racing with something like exhilaration. "You've made an enemy." Xavier shrugged. "I've faced worse than disapproving matrons." His expression softened as he looked down at her. "Are you upset with me?" Theodora shook her head, unable to suppress a small smile. "No, though I probably should be." He offered his arm and she took it, allowing him to escort her home through the dusty streets. The drought had left everything coated in a fine layer of grit, the world parched and waiting. "Would you like to come in?" Theodora asked when they reached her gate, the invitation holding new weight after the events of the evening. Xavier hesitated, then nodded. "For a short while. I need to be back at the ranch before dawn." Inside, rather than lighting the lamps, Theodora opened the windows to catch what little breeze stirred in the night air. They sat together on her small sofa, closer than propriety might dictate, but past caring about such constraints. "Did you mean what you said to Mrs. Wellington?" Theodora asked, her fingers twisting in her skirt. "About finding a woman of those qualities you mentioned." Xavier turned to face her, taking her restless hands in his. "I meant every word. Theodora, I know it's only been a few months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you." The words, so simple and so profound, hung in the space between them. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and freeing. "But I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of hoping again. Of believing in a future that might not be possible." Xavier reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "The future is never certain, Theodora, not for anyone. All we can do is face it together if you're willing." In answer, Theodora leaned forward and kissed him, a tentative brush of lips that quickly deepened as Xavier pulled her closer. His arms encircled her, strong and secure, as the kiss stretched into something more profound than either had expected. When they finally parted, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly, "before I forget myself entirely." Theodora nodded, though everything in her wanted him to stay. "Will I see you tomorrow?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised, pressing one last kiss to her lips before rising to leave. At the door, he turned back. "Theodora, will you marry me?" The question, so direct and unadorned, caught her off guard. "Xavier, are you certain?" "There's still the matter of children," he finished for her. "Yes, I know, and my answer is the same as before. I'm asking you to be my wife because I love you, not for what you might or might not be able to give me in the future." Theodora took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. "Yes," she said finally, "I'll marry you." Xavier's face broke into a radiant smile. "Sunday, after church," Theodora laughed, the sound unfamiliar in her own ears. "So soon, what will people say?" "They'll say exactly what they're already saying," Xavier replied with a shrug. "But we'll be too happy to care." That night, after Xavier left, the skies finally opened. Rain poured down in sheets, drumming on Theodora's roof and turning the dusty streets to mud. She stood at her window, watching lightning streak across the sky, feeling as though the heavens themselves were celebrating the love she had found when she least expected it. Word spread quickly through Val Verde about Xavier and Theodora's engagement. Some, like Mrs. Abernathy, expressed genuine happiness for the couple. Others barely concealed their disapproval or confusion. He could have had his pick of girls, Theodora overheard Mrs. Pratt telling another woman at the general store. Why settle for damaged goods? The words stung, but Theodora found they didn't cut as deeply as they once would have. Xavier's love had become a shield against such barbs, his unwavering belief in her worth a balm to her wounded spirit. Pastor Williams agreed to perform the ceremony that Sunday, though he insisted on meeting with them both beforehand. In his small office beside the church, he regarded them seriously over steepled fingers. "Marriage is a solemn commitment before God," he began. "Not to be entered into lightly, especially given the unique circumstances." "We understand the commitment we're making, Pastor," Xavier said firmly. "Mrs. Turner," the pastor continued, "have you been forthright with Mr. Caldwell about your medical history?" Theodora felt her face flush. "Yes, Pastor. Xavier knows everything." "And Mr. Caldwell, you understand that there may not be children from this union." Xavier's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I understand that no one can predict the future, Pastor. What I know with certainty is that I love Theodora and wish to make her my wife." The pastor studied them both for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. The ceremony will be at 4 o'clock after the regular service." On Sunday morning, Theodora woke to sunshine streaming through her window. The rains of the past few days had washed the world clean, leaving behind a freshness that seemed appropriate for a wedding day. She dressed carefully in a gown of pale blue silk, one she had made herself over the past few days, working late into the night by lamplight. It was simple but elegantly cut, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her one extravagance had been a length of cream-colored satin ribbon, which she used to trim the waist, the same ribbon Xavier had asked about the day they first met. Mrs. Abernathy arrived mid-morning, bearing flowers from her garden and an old family veil. "Something borrowed," she said with a warm smile, helping Theodora arrange the delicate lace over her upswept hair. The church was surprisingly full for their small ceremony. Some attendees were clearly there out of genuine goodwill, others out of curiosity, or a desire to witness what many considered a scandalous match. Theodora stood at the back of the church, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers and trying to calm her racing heart. When the piano began to play, she took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle. Xavier waited at the altar, dressed in the suit she had made for him, his face lighting up as he saw her. In that moment, the whispers and stares faded away, and Theodora saw only the man who had brought her back to life. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When Pastor Williams asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" a voice from the congregation responded, "She gives herself with our blessing." It was Mrs. Abernathy, speaking up in the absence of family. When it came time for the vows, Xavier took Theodora's hands in his voice strong and clear as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life. Theodora's own voice trembled slightly as she made the same vows, tears of joy blurring her vision. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Williams concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Xavier's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a pledge of the life they would build together. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Theodora was surprised to see genuine smiles among the assembled townspeople, even from some who had been coldest toward her. The Abernathys hosted a small reception at their home, with food and music, and even dancing in the cleared space of their front parlor. Xavier kept Theodora close, his hand rarely leaving the small of her back, his eyes frequently seeking hers as if to reassure himself that she was real, that she was truly his wife. As the evening progressed, Mr. Abernathy called for the guests' attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Xavier and Theodora," he said warmly, "may your life together be filled with joy, prosperity, and many blessings." There was a murmur of agreement as glasses were raised, though Theodora noticed Mrs. Wellington and a few others pursing their lips at the mention of many blessings, clearly a reference to children. Later, as the party wound down, Xavier led Theodora away from the gathering and into the Abernathy's garden, where they could speak privately. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "How does it sound?" "Wonderful," Theodora admitted, leaning into his embrace. "But also strange. I need time to get used to it." "We have all the time in the world," Xavier assured her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. They had agreed that Theodora would move to the small house on the Abernathy ranch where Xavier had been living. It was modest but sturdy, with enough room for her sewing business and the possibility of expansion someday. "Are you ready to go home?" Xavier asked softly. Theodora nodded, her heart fluttering with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. This night would be different from her first wedding night with Edwin, which had been a perfunctory consummation without tenderness or real connection. They said their goodbyes to the remaining guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. As Xavier helped Theodora into the wagon that would take them to their new home, she caught sight of Mrs. Wellington watching from the porch, her expression unreadable. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts as stars appeared in the velvet sky above. The house came into view, a lantern burning in the window Mrs. Abernathy's work, ensuring they would arrive to a welcoming home. Inside, Theodora found that her belongings had already been moved from her old house, her sewing machine set up in a corner of the front room, her clothes hanging neatly in the bedroom wardrobe. The Abernathys had even arranged a vase of fresh flowers on the small dining table. "You like it?" Xavier asked, watching her face anxiously as she explored their home. "It's not much, but it's perfect," Theodora interrupted, turning to face him with shining eyes. "It's ours." Xavier crossed the room in 2 strides, gathering her into his arms. "Yes," he murmured against her hair. "Ours." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Theodora's life. She and Xavier settled into a comfortable routine, with him working the ranch while she continued her sewing business from their home. In the evenings, they would sit together on their small porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. Xavier proved to be a thoughtful and passionate husband, attentive to Theodora's needs and endlessly patient with her occasional moments of uncertainty. The intimacy they shared was a revelation to her, an expression of love rather than duty, a communion of bodies and souls. On Sundays, they attended church together, sitting in the middle pews rather than at the back where Theodora had previously hidden herself. The town's attitude toward them gradually shifted as they witnessed the obvious devotion between the couple. Even Mrs. Wellington eventually offered a grudging acceptance, though she never became truly warm. As fall approached, bringing cooler temperatures and changing leaves, Theodora began to notice changes in her own body. Her monthly cycle, always regular, failed to appear. Her breasts became tender, and certain smells, particularly the coffee Xavier brewed each morning, suddenly turned her stomach. She said nothing to Xavier, afraid to hope, afraid to voice the possibility that had begun to form in her mind. She remembered too well the joy on Edwin's face when she had told him of her first pregnancy and the devastation that had followed. By the 3rd week of September, there could be no more denying the truth. Theodora was with child. She waited until evening after they had finished supper and were sitting together on the porch, Xavier smoking his pipe while Theodora worked on mending one of his shirts. "Xavier," she began, her voice catching slightly, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his expression open and attentive as always. "What is it, love?" Theodora set aside her sewing, her hands trembling. "I believe I'm expecting." Xavier went very still, the pipe halfway to his lips. "A baby," she nodded, watching his face anxiously for his reaction. "Yes, but Xavier, you must remember what happened before. I can't promise that this time will be different." For a moment, Xavier said nothing, and Theodora's heart clenched with fear. Then he carefully set down his pipe, knelt before her chair, and took her hands in his. "Theodora," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is wonderful news. But the risk is part of life," he finished for her. "We'll face it together, whatever happens." Tears filled Theodora's eyes. "I'm scared, Xavier. I don't think I could bear another loss." "I know," he said gently, reaching up to cup her cheek. "But we'll take every precaution. We'll get you the best care possible. And no matter what happens, I'll be right beside you. You won't face this alone." He moved his hand to rest gently on her still flat abdomen. "Our child," he whispered with wonder. "A new beginning." That night, as they lay together in bed, Xavier held Theodora close, his hand protectively covering her stomach. "I've been thinking," he murmured into the darkness. "If it's a boy, perhaps we could name him after my father, Thomas." "And if it's a girl?" Theodora asked, her voice small. Xavier was quiet for a moment. "What about Hope? It seems fitting. Hope." The word resonated through Theodora, stirring emotions she had long suppressed. "Yes," she whispered, "Hope would be perfect." The following Sunday, they shared their news with the Abernathys, who responded with genuine delight and immediate practical support. Mrs. Abernathy insisted that Theodora reduce her sewing workload and promised to help find a good midwife when the time came. Word spread through Val Verde, as it inevitably did in a small town. The reactions were mixed. Some offered sincere congratulations, while others exchanged knowing looks, clearly expecting history to repeat itself. "Don't you pay them any mind, Mrs. Abernathy advised when she caught Theodora noticing such an exchange at church. "People will always talk, but it doesn't change what's true." "And what's true?" Theodora asked, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach, which had just begun to show the slightest curve. "That you and Xavier love each other, and that this baby is a blessing, no matter what happens." As her pregnancy progressed, Theodora experienced a range of emotions: joy and anticipation intermingled with fear and anxiety. Each week that passed without complications was a small victory, but also brought her closer to the point where her previous pregnancies had failed. Xavier was her rock throughout, steady and supportive. He insisted on hiring help for the heavier household chores and made sure Theodora rested frequently. In the evenings, he would read to her from books borrowed from the Abernathy's library, his deep voice soothing as she worked on tiny garments for the baby. When Theodora reached the 5th month of her pregnancy, further than she had ever carried, before Xavier surprised her with a cradle he had crafted himself from oak wood, sanded smooth and finished with beeswax. "It's beautiful," Theodora breathed, running her hands over the polished wood. "Mrs. Abernathy helped me with the bedding," Xavier admitted, showing her the small mattress and soft blankets that lined the cradle. "I'm not much hand with a needle." Theodora laughed, tears of happiness blurring her vision. "It's perfect, thank you." That night, for the first time, she felt the baby move a-flutter like butterfly wings inside her womb. She guided Xavier's hand to the spot, watching his face transform with wonder as he felt their child's movements. "Hello there, little one," he whispered, his ear against her rounded belly. "Your mama and I are waiting for you." As winter descended on Val Verde, bringing cold winds and occasional snow flurries, Theodora's pregnancy continued without complications. Dr. Peterson, who visited from Austin once a month, expressed cautious optimism at each examination. "You're doing remarkably well, Mrs. Caldwell," he told her during his January visit when she was 7 months along. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, and your own health seems excellent. But my previous losses," Theodora began, "were tragic," the doctor acknowledged, "but not necessarily predictive. Each pregnancy is different, and you have much better care and support this time." He prescribed continued rest, a nourishing diet, and recommended that Theodora remain close to home as her time approached. "I'll try to be here for the delivery," he promised, "though babies have their own schedules, as I'm sure you know." February brought severe weather to Val Verde, with a blizzard that left the town isolated for nearly a week. Xavier worked tirelessly to ensure their home remained warm and stocked with provisions, while Theodora, now in her 8th month, found herself increasingly confined to the house. "I feel like a beached whale," she complained good-naturedly one evening as Xavier helped her settle into a chair by the fire. He laughed, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "The most beautiful whale I've ever seen." Theodora swatted at him playfully, then winced as the baby delivered a particularly strong kick. "I think we have a future cattle driver in here," she said, rubbing the spot. "Always on the move." Xavier placed his hand beside hers, feeling the strong movements of their child. "Active and strong-willed," he agreed. "Just like his mother." "Or her father," Theodora countered with a smile. The easy banter between them was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Xavier went to answer it, returning moments later with Mrs. Abernathy, her face pinched with concern. "It's Jenny Lewis," she explained, referring to a young woman who had recently married the new telegrapher. "She's gone into labor, but it's too early. The doctor can't get through because of the snow, and the midwife is down with influenza. What can we do?" Xavier asked, already reaching for his coat. Mrs. Abernathy turned to Theodora. "I hate to ask, dear, especially in your condition, but you're the only one in town who's had experience with early babies. Jenny's mother is beside herself, and the poor girl is terrified." Theodora felt the blood drain from her face. Her experiences with premature labor were hardly ones she wished to relive, much less advise others on. But the thought of the young woman, scared and in pain with no one knowledgeable to help her. "I'll come," she said, struggling to her feet. "Xavier, can you help me with my coat? Theodora, are you sure?" Xavier's face was creased with worry. "In your condition, I'll be careful," she promised, "but I can't sit here knowing I might help." The journey to the Lewis home, though only a few streets away, was arduous through the snow-choked streets. Xavier insisted on carrying Theodora part of the way, despite her protests about his back. Inside the Lewis home, they found chaos. Jenny, a girl of barely 20, lay on a bed in the front room, her face contorted in pain as another contraction seized her. Her mother hovered anxiously nearby while her young husband paced the floor, looking terrified. "Thank God you've come," Mrs. Lewis exclaimed, rushing to greet them. "She's been laboring since midnight and the pains are coming faster now." Theodora approached the bed, setting aside her own fears to focus on the frightened young woman. "Jenny," she said gently, taking the girl's hand, "I'm going to help you through this. You're doing wonderfully." Over the next few hours, Theodora drew on memories of her own experiences and things she had learned from midwives and doctors during her previous pregnancies. She showed Mrs. Lewis how to time the contractions and position Jenny to ease the pressure on her back. She sent Xavier and Mr. Lewis to boil water and prepare clean linens, keeping the men busy and out of the way. As dawn broke, Jenny's labor intensified. The baby was coming, ready or not. "You can do this," Theodora encouraged, wiping Jenny's brow with a damp cloth. "Your baby is strong." "I can tell." With a final, tremendous effort, Jenny delivered a tiny boy, smaller than normal but with a surprisingly lusty cry. Theodora helped clean and swaddle the infant while Mrs. Lewis tended to her exhausted daughter. "He's beautiful," Theodora whispered, placing the bundle in Jenny's arms. "Small, but fighting already." Jenny looked up at Theodora with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know what we would have done without you." Later, as Xavier helped Theodora back to their own home through the early morning light, she leaned heavily on his arm, exhausted but exhilarated. "You were amazing," he told her, his voice filled with pride. "The way you kept everyone calm, knew exactly what to do." Theodora smiled tiredly. "I just did what I wished someone had done for me, all those times before." Xavier stopped, turning to face her in the snow-covered street. "Do you see now? You're not cursed, Theodora. You never were. What happened to you was tragic, but it wasn't punishment or fate." Theodora considered his words, thinking of the tiny new life she had helped bring into the world. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully believe that her own child might survive, that the future could hold joy rather than sorrow. "Let's go home," she said, nestling against his side as they continued their journey. "Our baby is probably wondering where we've been all night." Jenny Lewis's son thrived despite his early arrival, a living testament to the possibility of survival that gave Theodora renewed hope as her own time approached. March brought warmer weather to Val Verde, melting the snow and making travel easier. Dr. Peterson was able to visit again, pronouncing Theodora's pregnancy progressing perfectly and predicting delivery in early April. As Theodora entered her final month, Xavier became increasingly protective, rarely leaving her side except when ranch work absolutely demanded his attention. He arranged for one of the Abernathy ranch hands, a young man named Billy, to take over most of his duties, allowing him to be close to home. "You're hovering," Theodora teased one afternoon as Xavier fluffed pillows behind her back for the third time. "Can you blame me?" He replied with a sheepish smile. "I just want everything to be perfect." Theodora caught his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "It already is perfect, Xavier. Whatever happens, we face it together, remember?" He nodded, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety not just for the baby's health, but for Theodora's as well. They both knew that childbirth could be dangerous for the mother, too. The first signs of labor came on a mild April evening as Theodora and Xavier sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. A dull ache settled in her lower back, coming and going at irregular intervals. "I think it's starting," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm Xavier prematurely. His head snapped toward her, eyes widening. "The baby," now Theodora nodded. "Early stages, I think. We have time." Xavier was immediately on his feet. "I'll send Billy for the doctor and Mrs. Abernathy." "What do you need? Should you lie down? Are you in pain?" Despite her own nervous anticipation, Theodora couldn't help laughing at his panic. "What I need is for you to breathe, husband. Help me inside and then you can send for help." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of intensifying contractions, whispered encouragements, and moments of fear that Theodora fought to keep at bay. Dr. Peterson arrived before midnight, his calm presence reassuring as he examined her and confirmed that everything was progressing normally. Mrs. Abernathy took charge of practical matters, keeping water boiling and linens clean, while gently but firmly preventing Xavier from wearing a path in the floorboards with his anxious pacing. "Go sit with your wife," she instructed. "Hold her hand. That's what she needs from you now." As dawn approached, Theodora's labor entered its final, most difficult phase. The pain was overwhelming, worse than she remembered from her previous deliveries. Doubt and fear threatened to consume her as she gripped Xavier's hand with each contraction. "I can't," she gasped after a particularly vicious pain. "Xavier, I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he insisted, his face close to hers, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're the strongest woman I know, Theodora Caldwell. Our baby is counting on you. I'm counting on you." With renewed determination, Theodora gathered her remaining strength. When Dr. Peterson told her to push, she did so with everything she had, Xavier supporting her back, whispering encouragement in her ear. "One more," the doctor urged. "The head is crowning, one more good push." With a final, Herculean effort, Theodora felt the baby slide from her body, and then the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a strong, angry cry filled the room. "A boy," Dr. Peterson announced, lifting the squalling infant for them to see. "A fine, healthy boy." Xavier's face crumpled with emotion as he looked from their son to Theodora's exhausted face. "You did it," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks. "You did it." The doctor placed the swaddled infant in Theodora's arms after cleaning him. She stared in wonder at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers that curled reflexively around her own. "Hello, Thomas," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Xavier perched on the edge of the bed, one arm around Theodora's shoulders, the other gently touching their son's cheek. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like his mother." In that moment, as the early morning sun streamed through the bedroom window, illuminating the three of them in its golden light, Theodora felt the last shadows of her past recede. The whispers of "cursed" that had followed her for years faded to nothing in the face of this miracle, not just the healthy child in her arms, but the love that surrounded her, the family she had found when she least expected it. "I love you," she told Xavier, leaning against his solid strength. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his eyes never leaving their son's face. "Always," he promised. "Always." News of Thomas Xavier Caldwell's birth spread quickly through Val Verde. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes, not just the Abernathys and other close friends, but townspeople who had once whispered behind Theodora's back. Even Mrs. Wellington brought a hand-knitted blanket, her expression softening as she held the healthy baby boy. "He has your eyes," she told Theodora with grudging admiration, "and his father's strong chin." Theodora accepted the compliment with grace, finding that old hurts no longer stung as they once had. She was too filled with joy, too busy learning the rhythms of motherhood, the middle of night feedings, the tiny changes in her son's expressions, the overwhelming love that seemed to grow with each passing day. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, rising with Theodora for night feedings, changing the baby with clumsy but willing hands, and spending hours simply watching Thomas sleep. His face, when he looked at his son, held a mixture of pride, wonder, and fierce protectiveness that made Theodora love him even more, if such a thing were possible. As spring bloomed into summer, life settled into a new normal for the Caldwell family. Theodora gradually resumed her sewing work, with Thomas napping in a basket beside her table or strapped to her chest in a sling. Mrs. Abernathy had shown her how to fashion. Xavier continued managing the Abernathy ranch, but made sure to be home for dinner each evening, eager to hear about his son's latest accomplishments, which, at 3 months, consisted mainly of stronger cries, more focused gazes, and the beginnings of deliberate smiles that melted both parents' hearts. One evening in late July, as they sat on their porch enjoying the cooler air after a scorching day, Xavier broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Mr. Abernathy made me an offer today," he said, gently rocking Thomas in his arms. "He wants to sell us a parcel of land on the eastern edge of the ranch. Says he's getting too old to manage the whole property and his sons aren't interested in ranching." Theodora looked up from her mending, surprised. "Our own land. Could we afford it?" Xavier nodded. "He's offering fair terms, and with the money I've saved, plus what the cattle business brings in. Yes, I think we could make it work. We could build a proper home there, Theodora. Something bigger, with room for Thomas to grow and maybe—" he hesitated. "Room for more children, if we're blessed again." Theodora set aside her sewing, considering the possibility. The thought of another pregnancy still frightened her, but Thomas's healthy birth had shown her that her body was capable of bringing life into the world, that not all pregnancies were destined to end in tragedy. "I'd like that," she said finally. "A home of our own on our own land." Xavier's face lit up. "Really? You wouldn't mind moving, starting fresh?" Theodora laughed, the sound light and free. "Xavier, I started fresh the day you walked into the general store and asked me about ribbon. Everything since then has been a gift I never expected." He leaned over to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby in his arms. "Then we'll do it. We'll build our future one day at a time." Through the fall and winter, Xavier worked with local carpenters to build their new home on the land they had purchased from Mr. Abernathy. It was a sturdy structure with 4 bedrooms, room to grow. As Xavier put it with a hopeful smile, a large kitchen with ample windows to catch the morning light, and a wide covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house. Theodora was involved in every decision, from the placement of windows to the layout of the kitchen. She designed a spacious workroom for her sewing business, which had grown since Thomas's birth, as women from neighboring towns heard of her skill with a needle. Thomas thrived, growing from a newborn to a curious, active baby who pulled himself up on furniture and babbled constantly. His first word, appropriately, was "Mama," followed closely by "Papa." His dark hair and hazel eyes were Xavier's, but his smile was all Theodora's, according to everyone who knew them. They moved into their new home on a bright spring day in 1878, just after Thomas's first birthday. Friends and neighbors helped with the transition, making the work light and the day festive. Mrs. Abernathy organized a house-warming gathering, with food and music and laughter filling the rooms that would soon hold the memories of a lifetime. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Theodora stood on the porch with Thomas sleeping against her shoulder, watching Xavier bid farewell to Mr. Abernathy with a warm handshake. "Happy?" Xavier asked as he joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Theodora admitted, "and a little amazed at how much has changed in just 2 years." Xavier nodded, gazing out at the land that was now theirs, rolling pastures where cattle grazed, a small orchard they had planted that would bear fruit in a few years' time, the creek that meandered along the eastern boundary of their property. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "Maybe it's time to make things official with Thomas." Theodora looked at him questioningly. "What do you mean, his name?" Xavier clarified. "Legally, he still has Turner as his surname since we weren't certain. Well, we didn't know if Edwin might return someday." It was true. Despite their marriage and Xavier's devotion to Thomas, they had hesitated to formally change the baby's last name, uncertain of the legal implications if Edwin ever reappeared to assert his rights. "But it's been over 3 years with no word," Xavier continued. "And Thomas is my son in every way that matters. I'd like him to have my name." Theodora considered this, then nodded. "Yes, I think it's time. Thomas Xavier Caldwell, it has a fine sound to it." They fell silent, content in the moment and the future it promised. Thomas stirred against Theodora's shoulder, making the small sighing noise that usually preceded waking. "I'll take him," Xavier offered, carefully transferring the drowsy child to his own arms. "You look tired." Theodora smiled gratefully. "A bit. It's been a long day." As she watched Xavier carry Thomas inside, murmuring softly to the sleepy child, Theodora felt a familiar flutter in her abdomen, one she had experienced only once before, in the early weeks of her pregnancy with Thomas. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. It could be nothing, of course, fatigue or excitement from the day's events. But there had been other signs over the past weeks. The tenderness in her breasts, the sudden aversion to the smell of coffee again, the subtle changes in her body that only she would notice. She hadn't said anything to Xavier yet, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely. But standing there on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set over land that would sustain their family for years to come, Theodora allowed herself to believe in possibilities. If she was indeed carrying another child, this pregnancy would be different from those that had come before. Not just because Thomas had shown that her body could nurture and deliver a healthy baby, but because she herself was different, stronger, more confident, surrounded by love and support instead of whispers and judgment. The future stretched before her, no longer a source of dread but a path of promise. Whatever came, another child, challenges she couldn't yet imagine, joys she dared not name, she would face it with Xavier beside her, Thomas in her arms, and courage in her heart. Theodora. Xavier called from inside. "Are you coming?" "Yes," she answered, turning toward the warm light spilling from the doorway of their home. "I'm coming." As summer progressed, Theodora's suspicions were confirmed. She was indeed expecting another child, due to arrive in the early months of the following year. When she finally shared the news with Xavier, his joy was tempered with concern for her well-being, but Theodora found herself facing this pregnancy with a confidence that surprised her. "It feels different this time," she tried to explain one evening as they sat on their porch swing, Thomas playing with wooden blocks at their feet. "Not just because of Thomas, though that helps. It's as if I've finally stopped waiting for disaster." Xavier squeezed her hand. "You deserve this happiness, Theodora. You always did." Thomas grew into a lively toddler, running on sturdy legs across the yard, chattering in increasingly complex sentences, and developing a fascination with the cattle that grazed nearby. Xavier began taking him on short rides around the property, the boy perched securely in front of him on the saddle, squealing with delight. Theodora's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Dr. Peterson, now a regular visitor to Val Verde, pronounced both mother and baby healthy at each examination. The town's attitude had shifted completely. Where once there had been whispers of curses, now there were smiles and genuine interest in the growing Caldwell family. In late February of 1879, as winter began to release its grip on Texas, Theodora went into labor. This time, there was less fear, more confidence in the natural process of bringing life into the world. Xavier was by her side throughout, his steady presence a source of strength when the pain threatened to overwhelm her. After a labor half as long as her experience with Thomas, Theodora delivered a healthy baby girl, her cries strong and demanding as she entered the world. "Hope," Xavier whispered as he held his daughter for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Hope Caldwell." As the family adjusted to the presence of a new member, Theodora often found herself marveling at how far she had come from the lonely, grief-stricken woman Xavier had met in the general store. Her days were now filled with the sweet chaos of raising two small children, managing her home, and continuing her sewing business on a reduced schedule. Xavier proved to be as devoted a father to his daughter as he was to his son, never showing preference for either child. He built a cradle for Hope that matched Thomas's, now converted to a small bed, and spent hours walking the fussy infant when she refused to sleep, singing old Tennessee lullabies in his deep voice. Thomas, at 2 years old, approached his role as big brother with a mixture of curiosity, jealousy, and protective instinct. He would peer into Hope's cradle, sometimes trying to share his toys with her, other times demanding attention when Theodora was busy with the baby. "Bye-bye," he would announce to visitors, pointing at his sister with a combination of pride and resignation that made adults smile. The Caldwell ranch prospered as Xavier implemented new breeding techniques and expanded their herd. He hired 2 full-time hands to help with the increasing workload, allowing him to spend more time with his family while still developing the business that would someday support his children's futures. As Hope's first birthday approached, Theodora found herself once again experiencing the familiar signs of early pregnancy. This time, she shared the news with Xavier immediately. their mutual joy untainted by the fears that had shadowed earlier times. 3 children, Xavier marveled as they lay in bed one night, his hand resting gently on the slight curve of her abdomen. If someone had told me 3 years ago that this would be my life, I wouldn't have believed it possible. Theodora turned to face him in the moonlight that filtered through their bedroom window. "When did you know that you wanted this life with me?" Xavier considered the question, his fingers tracing patterns on her skin. "I think I knew the first day in the general store. There was something about you, Theodora, a strength beneath the sadness. I wanted to know you to understand what had put that look in your eyes. And when you learned the truth, about my losses, the whispers of a curse, it only made me admire you more," he said simply. "To have endured such pain and still face each day with dignity, how could I not fall in love with such a woman?" Theodora nestled closer to him, grateful beyond words for the man who had seen beyond her grief to the person she could become. "And now look at us. Parents of 2 beautiful children with another on the way, a thriving ranch. And many more years ahead," Xavier finished, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "This is just the beginning, love." In September of 1879, Theodora gave birth to their 3rd child, a son they named James, after Xavier's father. Like his siblings before him, he was healthy and strong, with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Thomas, now 3.5, and Hope, at 18 months, regarded their new brother with fascination and a certain proprietary interest, as if they had somehow been involved in bringing him into the family. "My baby," Hope would declare, patting James's head with more enthusiasm than gentleness, requiring constant vigilance from her parents. "Gentle Hope," Xavier would remind her, demonstrating with his own large hand how to touch the baby softly. "James is little." As the years passed, the Caldwell family became a fixture in Val Verde. Xavier served on the town council and later as mayor for 2 terms, helping to guide the community through the changes brought by increasing settlement and the expansion of the railroad. Theodora, while primarily focused on raising their children, became known for her charity work, particularly with young mothers facing difficult circumstances. The ranch grew and prospered, eventually becoming one of the largest operations in the county. Xavier's innovative approaches to cattle breeding earned him respect throughout Texas, while Theodora's sewing business evolved into a small dress shop in town, managed mainly by a young apprentice she had trained, while Theodora herself handled the design work from home. Thomas, their firstborn, showed an early aptitude for ranching, shadowing his father from the time he could walk and developing a natural way with animals. By age 10, he was helping with real responsibilities on the ranch, his serious nature balanced by a quiet sense of humor that reminded Theodora of Xavier. Hope, true to her name, approached life with boundless enthusiasm and optimism. Creative and sociable, she filled the house with her artwork, stories, and the friends she constantly invited home. Her dark hair and expressive eyes came from Xavier, but her determination and compassionate heart were Theodora's legacy. James, their youngest, combined his siblings' traits with a thoughtful intelligence that often surprised his parents. An avid reader from an early age, he devoured books on every subject, particularly drawn to stories of exploration and distant places. The curse that had once defined Theodora's existence became a distant memory, occasionally recalled when a new mother in town faced tragedy, and Theodora would sit with her, sharing her own journey from grief to healing. Her history, once a source of shame, became a testimony of resilience that helped others navigate their own pain. On a warm spring evening in 1886, 10 years after Xavier had first ridden into Val Verde, The Caldwell family gathered on the porch of their home to celebrate Theodora's 40th birthday. The children had prepared a special dinner, with Xavier's oversight, and presented their mother with handmade gifts: a carved wooden box from Thomas, a watercolor painting from Hope, and a poem carefully copied in James's neat handwriting. After the children were finally in bed, Xavier and Theodora sat together on the porch swing, a quilt across their laps against the slight evening chill. The ranch spread before them, peaceful in the gathering dusk. "Happy?" Xavier asked, echoing the question he had asked her many times over the years. Theodora leaned against his shoulder, content in the life they had built together. "Beyond words," she replied. "You gave me this, Xavier, all of it." He shook his head, his arm tightening around her. "We built it together, but I remember when you couldn't see the possibility. How could I? After losing 3 babies, being abandoned, hearing those whispers everywhere I went, I thought I was finished with happiness." Xavier turned to look at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling as he smiled. "Do you remember what I said to you, that day you told me you were expecting Thomas? When you were so afraid?" Theodora nodded, the memory still clear after all these years. "You took my hand and said, 'Then we'll try again.' And we did," Xavier said softly. "Again and again." Theodora looked toward the house where their 3 children slept healthy, strong, the center of their world. Then she turned back to her husband, the man who had refused to let her believe she was cursed, who had seen possibility when she could only see pain. "Yes," she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "And we always will."